Hey everyone, welcome. It's Baron, and I'm happy to tell you that my Arc Ignite Elementalist is looking just fine this league, despite a couple of nerfs. I have been asked many times in the last few days, and yes, we are good to go. That is the too long did not watch summary. Yes, Arc Ignite Elementalist is alive and well, and I can recommend league starting it. I will link to the guide from the last league, which is mostly still valid, but I'll use this video here to quickly cover the patch changes that affect the build and how we will plan to manage those changes. For starters, just a very brief description if this is your first time looking at the build before you commit to checking out the full guide. Arc Ignite Elementalist is a beginner-friendly, tanky, self-cast mage-type build that uses a lightning spell called Arc to chain between several enemies per cast and set them all on fire. If I had to give it a 10-point scale on the major categories, I would say it gets an 8 out of 10 for defense, a 9 for damage projection / proliferation, only a 5 for bossing and other single targets, a 7 for leveling experience, an 8 for smoothness and ease of playstyle in the endgame, and a 7 for affordability, though of course that may change depending on the market. I wouldn't have made a beginner-friendly guide about the build if I didn't believe it averaged at least a 7 across all these categories. It's hard to achieve that, but that is what a good all-arounder guide should aim for. So, regarding budget, on a league start, zero currency, early mapping budget, it could achieve maybe 1 million DPS using just what you find off the ground and maybe trading a chaos or two on the market. And then if you put a few divines into it, you could achieve maybe 5-6 million DPS. Then a rudimentary endgame version for about 20 divines could be north of 8 million DPS. A pre-mageblood endgame variant for call it like 80 or 100 divine could go over 20 million DPS, and then a finalized, min-maxed version with mageblood and all the other bells and whistles, that shoots to go, and has gone, well beyond the damage over time cap of 36 million DPS, since uber bosses, they reduce your damage so much that going above the dot cap is actually important, it actually matters. So, the build. It makes use of Shaper of Flames, which is an Elementalist Ascendancy node that allows all types of damage to ignite and therefore cause damage over time. The build converts most of its initial hit damage that causes this ignite from the lightning spell Arc through several elements, from lightning to cold and even sometimes to fire. This is done paired up with the Incandescent Heart body armor to pick up a bunch of extra chaos damage at each elemental conversion stage, and all of that added damage will also contribute to the ignite. Originally, this conversion stuff also benefited our Nebulous Scepter endgame weapon, but we'll get into that in a minute. And that's the broad strokes of the build. But what is changing this patch, and how does it impact us if we want to league start this build? Starting with a brief summary. Golems. They were big last patch, they are now nerfed, but very much alive. The Nebulous Scepter. Again, nerfed but alive, and potentially even buffed if you have good implicits on the Scepter. This does mean higher expense, higher cost for top-end damage, but this weapon is still going to always outclass the best rare crafted weapon, even the mirror tier stuff. Next up, mercenaries. They are completely gone, so our aura setups, which sometimes relied on mercenaries in the last league, they will revert to look more like the 3.25 Settlers of Kelgar variant of the build, which also worked fine. Rune Graft of Recompense or Refraction. We'll cover this, likely a very nice damage buff being added for us if it works as stated in the patch notes. And then the Corruption Bloodline Ascendancy is going to be worth a look, and the overall build survivability has been indirectly improved by reduction in map modifier effect nodes. Also, we'll close out with, we need to keep an eye on these Breach Grafts. We're going to look for ones that fit well with this build as they get revealed. We haven't seen many yet. So let's dive in and talk about a few specifics from the patch notes. The Liege of the Primordial node went from 100% increased golem effect down to 50% increased golem effect. But this nerf isn't as dire as it seems. This was not our only source of increased golem effect. Between the Golem Commander passive wheel on the tree, the quality on the Golem gems themselves, and potentially a Primordial Bond notable if you find one on a Megalomaniac jewel, we previously had at a bare minimum 200% increased Golem effect and maybe more. So with this nerf, the Golems, which are giving us all kinds of offense and defense, they go from 3 times the value stated on the gems to maybe 2.5 times the value stated on the gems. So this is an absolutely deserved nerf. You probably know this if you saw how busted golems were last league. They were amazing. And for us, this build, the overall drop in numbers is completely manageable. It's not that bad. Going from 3 times the stated effect down to 2.5 times is very little. I honestly don't even think that there's any changes that we need to make to the build to account for this patch note. Next up, the Nebulous Scepter. Now, this is an interesting one because for a long time, myself personally, I was misunderstanding how the general stat called increased elemental damage impacted damage that is converted through several elements. This is a complex topic that I will try to simplify down. Basically, this all comes down to a visual artifact in Path of Building. Basically, the percent increased elemental damage mod, the one that it doesn't say percent increased fire or lightning or cold, it just says percent increased elemental damage, which covers all of those things. It appears, if you look at Path of Building, that this stat applies separately at each step of conversion. So if you have a lightning spell that you convert to cold, then convert to fire, then convert to chaos, yada yada, that it applies once at each step. However, this is a visual artifact. If you drill down into the numbers, you will see that the actual damage numbers that result from this stat, it only applies once. Increased elemental damage only applies once. There is no double dipping. You don't get, all right, I get my increased lightning damage, and then I convert it to cold, and then I get increased cold damage, and then I convert it to fire, and get increased fire damage. That's not how generic elemental damage increases work in this game. So why does that matter? Well, the Nebulous Scepter, our endgame weapon, it was changed in a few ways during this patch, but the major upshot is that instead of separately providing percent increased cold and percent increased lightning damage, which would double dip when we're converting damage like that, it is now that general effect, and it adds up all the resistances between 75 and 90. Don't worry about that too much. That'll be covered in the other videos, and it basically turns it into increased elemental damage. The bottom line, the thing that you need to understand, the take-home message here, is that previously, if you had a max roll on this scepter with this build, you could be dealing upwards of 600% increased damage in the ultra endgame version of the build. And now, not 600%, it is now only providing 450% increased damage. So no doubt, this is a substantive nerf, but there are 2 important ameliorating factors. Number 1, this is not even going to be our weapon until the 20 plus divine version of the build. So the campaign, early mapping, even basic endgame mapping, they're going to be totally unaffected by this change. And then number 2, there's a new line of text as part of this patch that gives increased effect of synthesis implicits. The item has always come with a random smattering of 3 implicit modifiers, and if we can just get 1 to 2 of those that are beneficial in our build, with this new text of increasing the magnitude of these implicit modifiers, it may wind up making the scepter either a lateral change from where it is right now, like basically equivalent damage, or even a buff over the old Nebulous. It does, however, mean that we are more reliant on getting these good implicits, whereas previously these were just nice to have bonuses. So I will admit this will impact the expenses of the super endgame variant of the build. You will still be able to get a very functional version of the build online, but if you really want to push it north of 20, 25, 30 million DPS, I think, this is my speculation, that this will be more expensive as a result of these changes. But regarding what these implicits are that you should be looking out for, they can get boosted by this effect, this increased effect of synthesis implicits. You're going to be looking for ignites deal damage faster is probably the best one, flat added damage to spells, damage gained as extra chaos, increased burning damage, flammability curse effect, increased cold, fire, lightning, elemental damage. They're all good. Potentially increased damage with vaal skills, since we do use vaal arc, depends on the situation. Hi Taco, thank you for hopping up. And then I don't think that fire damage over time multiplier can roll on synthesized scepters. For some reason, I think only cold damage over time multiplier can roll as a modifier here. I don't know why that is, but if fire damage over time multiplier could roll, that would be extremely desirable here too. Now, the trap modifiers to avoid at these synthesis implicits, you want to avoid increased spell damage and increased double damage, or chance of double damage. Neither of those help ignite at all. And then you also want to avoid flat damage that does not specify spells. If it just says it's adding flat damage, fizz, lightning, cold, fire, whatever, that's only for weapon attack purposes, not spells. Now, next up, the mercenaries being gone. I tried to be careful last league to not offload anything completely irreplaceable to my mercenaries, since the build functioned great in the previous league without mercenaries, and I didn't want to become too reliant on them. The main thing my version loses from last league is the quality of life from the haste aura. It helped me feel like I had mageblood before I had mageblood. I could run really fast, in other words. Basically, this just comes to mean that you're end game but not expensive setup. It's going to move a little bit more slowly than mine did last league during Mercenaries League, but it'll move at about the same speed as mine did when I first published the guide in 3.25. Now, the other thing to keep an eye out for with Mercenaries being gone is curses. We're not going to have a problem applying the curses that they were applying for us. It's just a question of fitting in the gems for them. We are a little tight on gem space in this build because of the golems taking up so many of those gem slots. So the mercenaries are no longer able to do the heavy lifting on applying things like elemental weakness and flammability for us. So it can be worth looking for some space-saving measures to get those curse gems fit into the build. So we can do things like get an Aegis Aurora shield with a corruption that grants determination, the aura, which doesn't need an extra gem socket. Or you could drop the faster attacks support gem that is linked to shield charge. Or, I think this is what I recommend, do what I have done and have a bossing gem swap. You don't need to do this, there are other ways around this, but if you're okay with a gem swap, what you could do is you could link faster attacks, a green support gem, to a red socket, and then that red socket will contain one of two active skill gems, either shield charge during mapping or smite for bossing. You will not need the clunky mobility given by shield charge during bossing scenarios. If anything, like during Cyrus, you don't want a shield charge, you want to be able to frost blink over the die beams or whatever, and then so that's, you don't need the mobility of shield charge during bossing, but then also, if you pump up your damage in other ways, you also don't need the flat damage from smite during non-bossing. So you can switch between the two. Smite for bossing, shield charge for non-bossing. This is personal choice, though. Next up, let's talk the Rune Graft of Recompense. It has been removed or replaced now with the Rune Graft of Refraction. If we read this graft literally, I think it's basically all upside for us. If we read it as given, it limits our number of projectiles, but makes our skills that chain an additional time. Now, Arc is one of these odd skills. It's rare, it's not common. It is not a projectile, but nevertheless, it chains. Most skills that can chain between enemies happen to be projectiles. And the rune graft doesn't specify that only projectile skills get the extra chain. But the drawback is based on limiting the number of projectiles. So it seems to me like only upside. This could be a buff for the build if it works the way it says it does. An extra chain, keep in mind, for this build, for Arc, it doesn't just improve clear speed to have that Arc go to that next extra enemy. The Arc gem has a baked-in effect, giving a more damage multiplier for enemies which are earlier in the chain sequence, based on whatever the number of remaining chains are. So adding an extra chain, Arc can chain 7 times, 8 times, 9, 10, 11. Adding that extra chain actually is a single target DPS boost when there's only one enemy around. So that's the rune graft. Then there's, I think, probably only there's at least one of the new Bloodline Ascendancies, these options that we've seen, and it's the Trial Master, the Corruption Bloodline. So we have seen 9 of these Bloodline Ascendancies so far. These let you allocate some of your precious 8 Ascendancy points, not all, but some of your Ascendancy points, to new alternate Ascendancies if you want, splitting your main Ascendancy with something else. One of these new ones. And these new ones seem to be a fusion of some Path of Exile 2 type Ascendancies, some Legacy of Frisia Ascendancies, which we all wanted to, I hope all of us, I did, wanted to make it into the game in some format, and then some that are just brand new altogether. And so far, of these 9 Ascendancies that have been shown, I think the Trial Master's Corruption Ascendancy is the one that is most likely to have an impact on this Arc build. It has an Ascendancy option that improves vaal skills. Priest of Kopek makes vaal Arc specifically cost 35 souls instead of 25, but in return it lets us store more than one use of vaal Arc, and more importantly, it makes it deal 35% more damage. So this is something that bears consideration, but not something that we would necessarily take by default. We've got to think about it. So 35% more damage is certainly impressive. It's the equivalent of approximately another full support gem, give or take. But we have to ask ourselves what we would drop in order to get it. Remember, we have to use our main 8 Ascendancy points, so 4 major Ascendancy notables. We can only take 4 total between our normal Ascendancy, Elementalist, and whatever we tack on here. So what would we drop? Let's see. So Shaper of Flames is the centerpiece of the build. It's non-negotiable. And then on top of Shaper of Flames, which allows all of our damage to ignite, we've got 3 pretty compelling Ascendancy options. It's difficult to see which we would drop for this 35% more multiplier for vaal Arc specifically. So for starters, aside from Shaper of Flames, we've also got Shaper of Storms. This boosts our damage pretty dramatically by setting a minimum threshold for the value of our shock. Shock is an ailment that causes the enemy to take increased damage. Any investment this build does into increasing shock magnitude will multiply on top of this new higher value that Shaper of Storms sets us at. So it's an enormous damage multiplier. It's very difficult to justify giving this up. We've also got Mastermind of Discord. This dramatically improves our exposure effect. This is our ability to lower enemy elemental resistances. Again, a very difficult thing to give up mathematically. And then, of course, there's the golems. I know that there are those who will argue that we should drop the golems and make up damage by finding alternate use for the gem socket. So if you do this, if you drop the golem ascendancy node, you drop the golems in general, you get these new gem sockets that you are dedicating to them to do other things with. However, even if you do this, I haven't seen any evidence yet that this makes up for the defenses that you're getting from the golems. Not just offense, the DPS, but the defense. It's very cozy. Stone Golem in particular, the new version of Stone Golem gives regeneration and global defenses, armor, and energy shield. I've got to tell you, as much as I love this build in 3.25 Settlers of Kelgur, I loved it even more in 3.26, and not just because of the mercenaries. The addition of that new Stone Golem effect, the global defenses, it's such an enormous quality of life boost, a comfort boost. You can transition to Chaos Inoculation so much earlier because of the Stone Golems. I honestly think that I would have a hard time giving it up. Maybe in like a super duper elite endgame version of the build, you could justify it, but I'm talking more about like, what are you doing in those opening days and weeks of a league? You know, even if it was a difference of a few million DPS, like you could gain a few million DPS by taking this crazy vaal ultimatum corruption ascendancy and getting more damage, I don't know if I would do it if I had to give up the defense to do it. Keep in mind, the DPS boost that you would get from taking this ascendancy, it is specific to vaal arc, not just arc. This is our super move, our ultra move. We're not using it all the time. This is mostly only going to come up in single target situations. Now, it's true that once you push the build far enough, most mapping scenarios are not going to require vaal arc in order to feel smooth. So maybe that's an argument in favor of decreasing your sheet DPS with regular arc in favor of boosting your vaal arc DPS with this corruption ascendancy, because that's going to be the important one for single target damage, right? That's where you need it most. Once you've boosted your regular damage through other means enough, maybe your sheet DPS doesn't matter as much. Like, you can get by with 10 million DPS, not 15 million DPS, as long as when you go to bossing, you've got that like 20 plus or whatever. That's just a general idea. I don't know. I think this one requires some experimentation, and it may even require a bit of personal preference. Like, what is your playstyle? Are you mostly mapping? Are you willing to pay for carries in bossing scenarios, that kind of thing? So I think it's going to depend. Me personally, I think that if I do run this build, this league, I'm probably going to stick with the golems, is my guess. I'm probably not going to go for the kind of glass cannon raw DPS boost from the corruption ascendancy, but that's not to say it is the wrong decision. We need to experiment with it, and it may very well be the right decision for the right person in the right circumstance. Now, on to the second to last topic. Let's talk about overall build survivability. Now, officially, the only change here is the modest reduction in the golem effect, so that reduces the stone golem effect that I was just talking about of global defenses and recovery. However, we should acknowledge that all builds in the game will be slightly more survivable in practical circumstances because of the changes that Grind Gear Games is making to map modifier effect. So, tons of these dangerous circumstances that we encounter in deep endgame maps, these come from the aggressive scaling of negative map modifier effects that we face. Things like non-curse auras being reduced, things like enemy physical damage being granted as extra elemental, things like our maximum resistances are reduced, or a plethora of other things. It's always going to be optimal to increase your map modifier effect because these negative effects are scaled at the same time that positive effects like quantity and rarity are scaled. So we always feel this kind of FOMO, fear of missing out, about not allocating increased map modifier effect because we want that added quantity and rarity, but it would always make the maps much more dangerous as a result. With these modifiers in many cases being removed from the Atlas passive tree, just in some places, but this means that all builds will by default feel a little bit less squishy in that ultra endgame mapping scenario. The exact scope of this effect definitely remains to be seen. We've got to figure it out, but we should mention this. And then just to close out the video with some pure speculation, talking about the Grafts, like I mentioned. It is clear both from context clues and from what the developers have stated outright that the Keepers of the Flame Grafts system is intended in large part to be power replacement for what we lost from the mercenary system. These Grafts, these are 2 items. You start with 1, and then through some questing system, you upgrade to 2 items that you're allowed to have that attach to your back. That's why I'm making this shoulder motion. And they grant you some specialized buffs. Now, we've only seen a few of these, but they appear to come in both generic variants that just add basic stats, as well as specialized or unique variants that grant specific new skills. From what we understand, some of these are manually activated and some can be triggered automatically, but so far as we know, we know very little about this so far. Now, obviously, this is not going to be the same type of power that we got from losing the mercenaries, but it is likely, and this is my point, that every build will be able to find something that makes itself stronger or opens up opportunity cost at other gear slots, other skill gems, other passive skill tree points. And I think of all the known patch notes, that's about it. I think those are the major things that could impact the build. So in summary, we will hopefully have a relatively lateral move from mercenary power to graft power. We will lose a bit of golem power, and we will need to invest a little bit more currency into our endgame nebula scepter in order to make it as strong as it has been previously. But from what I can see, that's about it on differences, particularly if you compare it to 3.25. Settlers of Calgary League, that implementation of the build, if anything, I think now that we've got golems, it's stronger than it was then. It's just maybe just not as strong as it was last week with mercenaries. We just don't know yet. But I still do think that it is in fact stronger than it was when I first introduced this build. So the question is, will I be league starting it myself personally? And that remains to be seen. You know, I'm experiencing what you're all probably experiencing, that usual pre-league indecision and about what build you're going to start. And for me, it's multiplied by about 1,000 by all these exciting possibilities offered by the new Bloodline Ascendancies, and then it's multiplied again by the fact that I've had to put so much time and work in on this Arc Ignite Elementalist that I'm kind of feeling eager to play something else. I'm kind of itching, like, should I find something else? I'm looking around. But I will say it is great to know that I have this build, this incredibly solid backup option in place, knowing that I've got a lot of experience with it, knowing that it's going to be just fine this league. And so for you, the viewer, I also want to note that I'm going to be active in my Discord server, which I'm going to link in the description of this video. I will be helping folks who want to make the build work this league, regardless of whether I decide to league start it myself or not. Now, let me know down in the comments if you have any questions or concerns, or if you've spotted anything that I might have missed in terms of changes that may impact this build. But in the meantime, I feel that this is, to conclude, a strong league starter that I can recommend to somebody without any Path of Exile experience or with any level of Path of Exile experience, and I would be thrilled if you gave it a shot. Thank you so much for tuning in, and take it easy.